Zero Mark here with a retrospective on the Slayer event of this past weekend and overall discussion of where we are with Slayer events. The past few have been a bit of a disaster, with the elite bosses kind of dominating the scene and making it so that most of the bosses were just completely ignored and everybody just went after elite bosses. So bosses were escaping left and right because it just didn't make sense to fight most of the bosses, because the trophies you got from them were so small and the ones you got from the elite bosses were so huge that just it didn't make any sense to bother fighting with the lower levels of bosses. And so it just became an uninteresting, boring kind of event. So this week they made a few changes, and I think they did a very good job of rebalancing the trophy rewards. So they got rid of elite bosses and replaced them with a radiant boss. But the radiant bosses had the same trophy rewards as the Inferno Cobalt bosses. So you didn't have that same crazy jump to elite boss trophy levels. So you actually had a much better balance. I think there's still a little bit more room for adding some variation in between the Emerald bosses and the Cobalt bosses, because you were jumping straight from a boss that, like an Inferno Emerald boss, was giving you about 20 million trophies, and an Inferno Cobalt boss was giving you 150 million trophies, and I think there's probably room for something somewhere in the middle. Also, the lower tier bosses, so below the Emerald boss, are still pretty much worthless. Even the highest level ones of those were giving you maybe 1 million trophies, and when you can fight one Cobalt boss and get 150 million, and you're only getting 1 million from the bosses, the low-level bosses, that's still a pretty giant gap. And I think there's a little bit of room to kind of continue working on the balance, but definitely much, much better, because last Slayer event prior to this one, the basic bosses were still giving you 1 million trophies, but the elite bosses were giving you billions of trophies. And so there was just no purpose whatsoever for those low-level bosses. At least in this one, it was better balanced, but I think there's still a little bit more room to go. But overall, really liked that change. The place where they need to work on making that a similar kind of change is with the guild bosses, because the guild bosses this time around, the Radiant boss that showed up that had 4.5 million trophies, was comparing to the basic bosses that were having thousands of trophies. And so you had the same kind of problem there, that the basic guild bosses, you were just trying to get out of the way, and your ranking depended solely on how many of the Radiant bosses you could kill. And so if you were in a guild that couldn't kill the Radiant bosses, then you just had no chance of placing anywhere, and all of the guild's resources needed to be dumped into killing as many elite bosses as possible, because there was just nothing beneath them. You went straight from 4.5 billion trophies down to the basic trophies were in the thousands, like maybe 100,000, and so you'd have to kill 45 of those to come close to one Radiant boss. And you have to do that with the same number of people tagging the boss, so it just became unrealistic. It was basically about how many people could you get to tag the Radiant bosses and how many of them could you kill. So I think they need to do some balancing in the guild boss trophies. But overall, I think hugely positive changes this particular Slayer event. I had a lot more fun with it than I did the past 3 or 4 Slayer events. So hopefully they continue making changes like this for Slayer going forward. Until next time.